Welcome back to the Unexpected Podcast. My name is Justin Mahwikizi, and we welcome back our guest, Matthew Hoh, to the podcast. Thank you for gracing us with your presence, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for having me back on, Justin.
Absolutely. So here we are. The Trump-Xi summit has been conducted and concluded. And I wanted to bring you back on to tell our audience what your thoughts were from an analysis perspective, what actually transpired, what was spinned, and what the reality is.
It doesn't look like a whole heck of a lot happened, right? I mean, it doesn't look like there was much, certainly very little, if anything, come to an agreement. And, in terms of things that will happen in the future, very little, if anything, of that. And then the issues regarding, say, the Persian Gulf, the war with Iran, but even, the issues regarding Taiwan, trade and tariffs. The commentary coming from both sides is all that we'd heard before. And then the readouts from both sides following the end of the summit were similarly vague or disagreeable. So, wherein the United States says that, with regards to, say, the war in Iran, the United States says that China states that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon and that the Straits of Hormuz must be opened. You get no similar commentary or certainly no confirmation of that from the Chinese in their readout. And so, it was, there was a lot to do, but it doesn't seem like there's very much in the end that came out that will be of any, significance going forward. Certainly nothing that was established, nothing was agreed to. So a lot of I think we're hoping to see something tangible. And I think many people who hoped that the Chinese would somehow come in some form of deus ex machina and serve as the mediators and put an end to the war and the crisis and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. And that certainly did not happen.
Yeah, I was very surprised. Well, number one, there wasn't a unified communique that typically these summits usually result in. So both sides had to send their own kind of version of what they think happened. And number two, on the trade side, China announced a purchase of 200 airplanes, although 500 airplanes was expected by analysts, and Boeing's stock went down by 4%.
Right.
And so that's a big indicator.
Right.
From that perspective, China, I think, asserted itself on the global stage. And the agricultural purchases that they promised there's no commitment behind it. And so, what are your thoughts on that? What's the message China is trying to communicate here?
I think the demonstration was clear that the Chinese feel that they are in the position to be able to write the path forward, to be able to determine future outcomes, that the United States has very little leverage over China, that the United States has exposed itself through this failed war in the Middle East, but also through failed trade policies, through previous attempts to muscle China, last year's tariff attacks on a variety of nations, but also including China. All that essentially precipitated a nascent bond crisis, right? Further farm foreclosures and bankruptcies in the United States, and delivered what? Essentially the Chinese being able to dictate, I think, going forward terms. I mean, and here this issue where, that Boeing was the one thing that was supposed to be the big deal. Donald Trump took 5 or 6 billionaires with him. From Apple, Nvidia, Boeing, of course. Elon Musk from Tesla, and one or two others. And the Chinese seemed unimpressed, right? The Chinese seemed unimpressed, almost like Donald Trump was showing off his billionaire friends, and Xi really couldn't care less. And so, it's interesting too this 500 plane sale that was supposed to happen was really supposed to, underscore the foundations of Boeing going forward in many ways, particularly since Boeing is is the only of the top five defense industry firms, the big five weapons contractors, that in the last 90 days has seen their share price remain even. All the others, Northrop, Lockheed, Raytheon, et cetera, have all seen their share prices drop. And the idea behind that was that Boeing's civil side, their airliner division, was what was keeping that company's stock from meeting a similar fate. And, so as you just said, it dropped 4 points, and people are, what happened? Wasn't this deal received? But I think that's just that story there in itself just shows the high expectations, maybe the arrogance of the Americans, and looking into Beijing. Again, in the summit itself being a microcosm or a symbol of the larger larger U.S.-China relationship, and that the Americans fully representing the 20th century and the Chinese representing the 21st century, and the Americans not having the leverage they once may have had, and the Chinese being in a position to tell the Americans in many ways, take it or leave it.
Yeah, I mean, in any negotiation, it's the party that's willing to take the most pain long term that usually tries, prevails. And China has shown that they have an ability to do so from a geopolitical and economic perspective. And I mean, if we move even on to the AI chips, he went with NVIDIA, and the CEO of NVIDIA was hoping to get some relaxation on U.S. Export rules for chips into mainland China. And I think that there was a limited allowance for specific companies, but not a wholesale lessening of those restrictions. And even on his side, I guess being a billionaire still doesn't give you that status to move the United States policy that way.
Right. Exactly. I mean, so again, desires, expectations, thoughts on how this might be played out in terms of what might come out of this summit, and just not there, right? Just a lot of travel, a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of speculation, and then the president of the United States leaving. And it wasn't this is not a summit where the hostility was apparent. This wasn't a summit that broke down. There are unless there is a change. The expectation is maybe another summit this year, right, in September.
Correct.
But the underlying aspect of this to me was just how weak the American president and weak American industry looked coming out of China. Not empty-handed, but as we were saying before, with much less than what did. And then overall, the geopolitical aspects of this, the Americans stating, or the Americans needing help to get out of this failed war they are stuck in Iran, and the Americans putting out in their readout, as you said, there was no joint joint statement at the end of the summit, as you usually get with these kind of things, but just you had your standard regular diplomatic readouts, and the American readout saying the Chinese essentially were backing the Americans in terms of the Iranians have to open the Straits of Hormuz, and saw at the same time as the Americans released their readout, their statement, you saw the Iranians allow about 30 Chinese ships to transit through the Straits of Hormuz, and the Chinese paying the toll or the environmental management fee or whatever they're calling it. So Americans put out a press release, and then the Chinese parade their ships through the Straits of Hormuz, handing over their tokens, gold or whatever. They got Easy Pass or whatever they got on their ships, but that type of 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 that dissonance there between what the Americans are insisting and what we're seeing play out in the real world. And again, that's just, I think, another example of the overall deterioration of American power, the overall decline of the American empire and American hegemony. And here we are now, wondering if this meeting between Trump and Xi was just you know a bump on the calendar to prevent war from from prevent the war from restarting.
Yes, I think that both sides wanted to cool things down or at least maintain some type of status quo. But the fact that China buys about 90% of Iranian crude oil and those ships being allowed and China paying the toll in yuan, it's a bigger statement, and it reinforces the point you made on our last episode that this is a new century. There is a turning point, and it hasn't shaken out to see what the long-term impacts are going to be, but it is certainly surprising on my side and remarkable that these events were just transpired in the last 48, 72 hours.
Yes, yes. I mean, this how rapidly things can kind of fall apart, right? Or how rapidly things can decompose, or how, I think what happens is you hit a critical juncture and then the process reinforces itself. And so I think the world watching this summit, watching the American president walk away, I don't want to say humiliated, but he certainly did not have the stature you would expect of an American president, particularly one as proud as Donald Trump is. And the emptiness of the lack of results, right? The vapidity, in the days following this summit, with nothing concrete, nothing tangible. We were talking about the things that were accomplished were less than what was expected or desired. And I think the rest of the world is watching that, right? And so now they see the United States, one, buck the entire international system, the international order. Well, for even further, the world sees the United States fail to marshal the entire world against Russia, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Certainly support from parts of the world, but when it comes down to enforcing the sanctions, the blockade, the embargoes on Russia, the support isn't there. Nations that you would expect to fall in line with or see the benefit of being in the American camp choose not to do so. And that's India, that's Turkey, right? I mean, you have, excuse me, you then have the support of the United States for Israel's genocide in Gaza, completely demonstrating the United States' lack of commitment to international order, to international institutions, to international law. And then you have this war now on Iran, and the Americans failing in this war, creating circumstances for themselves worse than existed prior to the start of the war. And now you have the American president showing up in Beijing, and it was underwhelming, right? It was underwhelming. I think this is how the world is watching this unfold. And I think what occurs then is you have a rapidity as things start to break down. So you have a feedback cycle, if you will, where seeing the ability of the Chinese to shrug essentially to the Americans when the Americans show up, and then demonstrate that we are going to continue to support Iran here, in the way that they did. We're going to go through, we're going to participate in their, in their ownership of the Straits of Hormuz. I think that signals to many, many other countries that this is the path, this is the way, this is the course that the world is on. And so we're only going to see, I think, further, whether it's fragmentation, in the American alliance and the American order, or nations outside of that orbit, nations outside of that order, understanding how weakened that order is and having confidence, becoming more bold, doing things to the American order, to the American system, right, the American empire, and as well as to other effects. The UAE leaving OPEC, right? I mean, this
Yes.
UAE Israel alliance that existed before the war, right? But which this war has really put out into the daylight and has only strengthened. So I think we're going to see more things like that as well. I mean, and there's, but also too, I mean, just to one more point on this, this idea of nations gaining confidence and strength. And maybe it's not so much confidence or strength, or maybe it's an understanding of how weak the Americans may be. You look at Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is essentially saying to the United States, you can't use our airspace, you can't use our bases to carry out your Project Freedom. So Donald Trump touts to much, trumpets this notion of Project Freedom, which was going to be the American Navy essentially opening up the Straits of Hormuz. And then within 36 hours, that has collapsed. And the reason why it collapsed is because the Kuwaitis and the Saudis say, you can't use our airspace, you can't use our bases for this. The story that goes with it, Justin, is that the Kuwaitis and Saudis were upset that there was not a stronger American response to Iranian attacks on UAE. That seems to me to be simply a fabrication. That seems to be a story that's being told to excuse or to hide or to cover the reality of that. It wasn't that's not the case. This is a Kuwaiti and Saudi effort to de-escalate the war, to ensure that the war does not become hot again. I think they understood that if the Americans did carry out this Project Freedom, it would end up into battles between the Americans and the Iranians, which then could escalate to include attacks once again on Kuwaiti and Saudi territory, including, or most specifically, their energy infrastructure. So the Kuwaitis and the Saudis said, we're not going to let you use our airspace, use our bases. It was excused as, again, the Saudis and Kuwaitis saying we're upset with the Americans for not respecting the Emiratis and by extension the Arabs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is now, 2-3 weeks later, or however long it's been, that closure of the airspace still is in place for Project Freedom. The Kuwaitis and the Saudis have said you can use our airspace. They haven't said that. I mean, so what you saw there was the Kuwaitis and Saudis standing up to the Americans, forcing the Americans to refrain from further escalating the situation, refrain from creating a circumstance where the war could begin again. And I think this idea that even a month ago, 2 months ago, or 3 months ago, the Kuwaitis and Saudis doing such a thing was an impossibility or an improbability.
Yes.
And now you see them willing to do these types of things. So, I think you put all that together and you see this weakening of the American system, the American order, and as we spoke about before, the closure of the American century and the establishment of the 21st century.
Yes, and this is also accentuated by President Trump lessening his language regarding Taiwan. I think he put a arms deal on hold, or at least will evaluate until further notice, and didn't stand on that strong language typical presidents usually say regarding Taiwan and the relationship with the United States. And so there's a parallel here with the United Kingdom after the Suez Canal incident. They started declining their empire, at least projecting their empire. If you're extrapolating on what the options are available here for the United States, what are likely the moves that President Trump will take, given this, and knowing that President Xi is coming back in September for another summit? In the meantime, what's going to be the U.S. actions, or at least set of decisions at their disposal regarding the Iranian conflict?
With Iran, it's hard to say, Justin, right? Because we're dealing with Donald Trump here, And we have a man who is incredibly fickle, incredibly his temperament is, I mean, it's the predictability here is near impossible. And so you certainly have aspects or elements where you can see Trump will restart the war, where Donald Trump would say, I need to have a clear victory here. We need to seize the uranium dust, the nuclear dust, as he calls it. Like Donald Trump has a vision for this is how it is won. That there is an event that creates victory, and I must achieve that. He's backed, of course, by the Israelis who want to see regime change. I don't think, for the Israelis, the nuclear issue exists, but their main thing is regime change. And I think that's the same for the Americans who have been agitating for a war with Iran since 1979 to restore the American order, to ensure Americans throughout the Middle East. I mean, so there is that one. You see very clearly this is results. Maybe he does believe that the Iranian government was close to collapse. He does believe that the United States has destroyed Iran's military capabilities, and that's a question of just doing more. And then once that's done, it's done. So that exists there. But then there's the other side as well, the side that is of Donald Trump that is willing to change his mind, a side that is, willing to walk away from things. We have seen this very often. We mentioned the tariff war of last year, as well as his trade war from his first term. Certainly things that he was willing to turn around on, make about face, or if not a total about face, a half face, right? So it's really difficult to figure out what they're going to do here. It seems as if they do go back to war, the idea would be to strike at Iranian infrastructure harder than it did before. That, of course, seems foolish because the Iranians have made clear that they will attack the Gulf states' infrastructure. The Iranians have made a threat that for every one facility of ours you blew up, we'll blow up 4 of theirs. And there is this idea too that once you do that, then you have the Americans would have the ability to really enforce sanctions, really to have a severe blockade on the country that would cause such harm to the Iranian people that they would capitulate, that they would give up, or they'd be so angry about they would overthrow their government. And then the idea too that you go back to this belief that it's just a matter of time before the Kurds stage an uprising, or the Baluchs, or the Azeris, and Donald Trump brings this up every second or third week. I feel like he brings up this notion that the United States gave weapons to the Kurds and the Kurds didn't use them. And so very similar to what it looked like from 1991 to 2003, where the United States had draconian sanctions on Iraq. The United States was bombing Iraq every 4th or 5th day over those 8 years. And the idea of just basically stirring the pot, and the hope that somebody is going to lead an uprising. And of course, during the 90s, the United States backed failed uprisings in Iraq, and so you'd expect the same on. And but that's the plan that was for 1991 to 2003 in Iraq, I said 8 years, 12 years, in 1991 to 2003 in Iraq, and it didn't work. And Iran is a completely different country than Iraq. I mean, its size, its geography, its demographics, its history. I mean, all these things. Iran in 2026 is much different than Iraq in 1991. But this is, I think the idea then of you're mowing the lawn, you're containing Iran. The Americans can say that, look, we stood up to the Iranians. Donald Trump can say no other American president was ever willing to stand up to the Iranians the way I did. Ronald Reagan wouldn't even do this. I mean, right? So it's. I think that may be where the Americans are heading. if there's not a negotiated settlement. But the Americans certainly are running out of time. The midterms are coming up. The American economy is worsening. So why this idea that they launched this war of choice, this war of aggression, with poor public opinion behind it, on top of a faltering economy that would be vulnerable to the very economic consequences or economic warfare that Iran could wage. You really tend to see that there is such an extreme amount of hubris involved here, as well as just ignorance, as well as just a confidence stemming from the success of the American operation in Venezuela. But certainly as we get through May and as we head towards June, the idea that the American president has to make a decision. He cannot dither any further because of American domestic political realities is right there. I mean, I believe that the current status is something the current status of this indefinite ceasefire or this frozen conflict or whatever you want to call it, is something that both sides could live by. That it's a modus vivendi that both sides could benefit enough from, that face their publics and say, look, for the Iranians, we stood up to the Americans and the Israelis, and now we control the Straits of Hormuz, and we dished it out as good as we took it, and as to the internationally, one is now a world power. So certainly the Iranian come out of this as it currently exists, claiming victory, and Donald Trump can do the same thing as well. The problem with this, of course, is Lebanon. Whether or not the Iranians would allow the current war in Lebanon to continue. The Iranians have been insistent that anything regarding this war includes Lebanon. And then, of course, the Israelis themselves. And, for Benjamin Netanyahu, who is facing some of the fiercest political criticism he's faced over the last few years because of these ceasefires, this status quo is not what they want. It's not domestic. It doesn't provide it doesn't provide what they wanted in terms of regime change or fracturing Iran and making it weak, having it fall into civil war, whatever, so that it couldn't be an impediment or an obstacle or an adversary in the Middle East. But also, too, it doesn't serve Netanyahu's purposes in terms of his own domestic political purposes. The idea was that this war would go well. There'd be regime change. It'd be very popular in Israel, and then elections would occur. The Israelis have to have their elections by October, and actually, they just there's a motion or filed in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, just the other day, and so you're looking at Israeli elections probably end of August or so, I guess.
Oh, wow.
The idea being that this war would be successful, right? And then Netanyahu would sweep into elections and go back. But now Netanyahu is facing a tremendous amount of political opposition because of the ceasefire in Iran, because of the, quote, ceasefire, unquote, in Lebanon. And you see that his chief adversary, his chief opponent, or Yair Lapid with Naftali Bennett, they've aligned together, Bennett and Lapid, based upon the Lebanese ceasefire. I mean, so you don't see anything where this status quo, this indefinite ceasefire, is of benefit to the Israeli leadership. And then, of course, the issues with Lebanon for the Iranians. So that makes me think that something is going to break at some point because of those two things. Otherwise, I think the Americans and the Iranians could go along with this, and the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz situation would slowly unravel, would slowly get back to, day by day, the conditions would get better. And then by the end of the summer, maybe you'd see a return to full traffic with this new toll. But then at least the markets would be stabilizing. Although, as you know, the issues with already this shutdown of the Gulf for the last 2 months or last 3 months, essentially, has meant that those markets, whether it's the petroleum and gas market, whether it's all the byproducts, all the downshore markets that come from that, there's a latency. And so we're going to be feeling effects of this closure well through 2027, even if everything was restored to today. So that may not be, enough time then, if things go back to normal by the end of the summer, for the American midterms to be removed from this war. I think the idea is always that with these wars, if you can end it, and then you've got a decent interval between the elections,
Right.
right? Yeah. But I don't know if that'll be the case
People
this
will
time.
forget, but the gas prices here in the suburbs of Chicago, so it's not Chicago proper. They're close to $6 a gallon.
Oh, yeah.
And the farmers out here are really hurting. Like you said, family farms are going under, or in the threat of going under. The banks are circling the wagons, and I'm a board member of a foundation called the International Farming Foundation, and we're talking to farmers, and they're really, really hurting, and some of them feel betrayed. But there's a sliver of hope with the September meeting between President Xi and President Trump, so close to the election. That's after Labor Day, I think. And the question is, can that be a bookend, depending on what happens between now and then? But we'll see. Like you said, there's so many risks and unpredictability. There's two other items that I wanted to cover. Somehow, President Trump was able to declare a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine during the celebrations of the remembrance of World War II, and it seemed like it was pretty well observed on both sides. What do you make of that?
I mean, it shows. It showed, one, the ability of the two sides to work together. This has always been the case. The Russians and Ukrainians have carried out dozens of prisoner exchanges. They had the Black Sea grain deal. They've had other limited ceasefires. They had talks at the very beginning of the war that, according to a list, was longer each day of former diplomats, political leaders, journalists, etc. Was very close to being signed. So it shows that there is an ability for the two sides to work together. That even though both sides said there are violations, it was more or less largely, the ceasefire largely observed, and particularly as we're in these last couple days, the large-scale attacks on both Kyiv and then Moscow by both sides, utilizing their drone fleets, showing that if one of these sides wanted to violate the ceasefire, they certainly could have.
Yeah.
Right. I think one of the things with that ceasefire meant to protect essentially the Russian Victory Day celebrations in Moscow was, this idea that this war much worse, and that if the Ukrainians were to attack the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, that would have resulted in a Russian escalation to the war that would have then, moved us much further up the escalation ladder.
Oh, yes.
I mean, one of the things about this war, for all the horror of it, for everything we've seen, with the videos we've seen coming out of this war for the last 4 years, the entire destruction and leveling of towns and cities, the complete ruination of Ukrainian land and air and water. You've seen a very restrained Russian attack on Ukrainian infrastructure, civilian targets, as well as government targets. The Russians have made this threat a few times, referencing Zelensky walking around, in his, walking around in Kyiv. This idea that they haven't targeted those things. I mean, you contrast the Russian warfare against Ukraine, say, with the Israeli and American warfare against Iran. And you see really how restrained the Russian warfare has been, and for the most part, too, the Ukrainians as well. The Ukrainians have not attacked. The Ukrainians have been willing to do more sabotage. They've been willing to assassinate, Russian generals using car bombs. They've killed Russian civilians that way. But the Ukrainians, they did at one time try and strike the Kremlin with a drone a few years ago, and they did launch that attack on Valdai, Russia, the Russian president's, second home or whatever. But you've not seen the sustained campaigns against civilian or targets, government targets, infrastructure, as you have had, like with the American and Israeli wars. I think that's the fear that everyone has here, is that that's where this would go. That if the Victory Day celebrations have been attacked, it would have led to a Russian escalation from which it would have been very difficult to back down from. But that war is a war that I think the Russians have walked away from negotiations at this point. The comments from Vladimir Putin following the Victory Day celebration, particularly his comments towards the Americans and how he just doesn't really see an American role anymore in the war in terms of mediating, in terms of negotiating. I think the Russians' plan is to seize the rest of Donbass, so finish their conquest of Donetsk, Luhansk, and then the other two provinces, Zaporizhia and Kherson, they've more or less reached the farthest point of their advance. A lot of that is just basically along the river that runs there, and then settle down and establish that as their territory. They're actually going to hold things there this year in those conquered territories. So I think the Russians, because the Russians have a lot of pressure building on them, not that does come from the economic warfare against them, that comes from the sanctions, but more so comes from the reality of running a wartime economy.
Yes.
And the reality of putting all your money into a war and not into your society. And after several years, that really starts to weaken your population. That starts, right? The choices that the Russians are having to make consistently now in terms of allocation of war or society is really starting to show. And so while the war is still popular in Russia, while Vladimir Putin is still very popular, we have been seeing the signs of a wartime economy that I think many of us have been saying. This is what I was saying a few years ago, trying to, if I was advising the Russians, was that you may be doing well now. You maybe do well for the next couple of years. You're not in a position to lose this war. You can't lose this war, just as Ukrainians can't win this war. But that doesn't mean you can win the war. It doesn't mean that there will be consequences to this war that won't make themselves apparent and very serious, that will force you into a negotiation to end it prior to when you might want to. So, this idea that the Russians are now in a position where they have achieved most of what they are looking for. I know they want to fulfill everything that they have said, but also too, the pressures on them now are great, and the dangers of escalation are there. This idea that for the Russians, as they took 550 drone strikes from the Ukrainians over the weekend, 100 of them just in Moscow. Wow. And, the Ukrainians produce a lot of those drones, but a lot of those drones are also produced in Europe. And certainly the Ukrainians could not fight this war without the European support. And so the pressure on Vladimir Putin, his government, to do more, to escalate the war, to go after the facilities throughout Europe where these drones are manufactured, is, every day is getting greater and greater. So for the Russians, you then have this, right? You get these trapped between political calls to escalate the war and the reality of what a wartime economy that drags you down. and you achieve most of your demands. So I think when Vladimir Putin said, following the May Day, the Victory Day celebrations, excuse me, that the war was coming to an end, I think that is what he was looking at. That his room in this war, his political space in this war, is running out. And between pressures to escalate the war, to expand the war into Europe, or the pressures at home, he has to end this thing. And again, he's made it clear he doesn't believe the Americans are going to be involved. At least that's what he said. But we'll see about that. But certainly, I think that there will be overtures to end the war coming from the Russian side throughout this year. But if those aren't accepted, this war goes on, until next year, and it can go on to the following year. Always we're dancing around the dangers of the war escalating and becoming the World War III that we've all dreaded for 80 years.
That's an excellent analysis. What about on the European side? Internally, the European powers are also facing some economic pressures and demographic issues from their populations. And President Zelensky is also facing some internal issues on the Ukrainian side. What are the pressures on Zelensky's side and the European powers are helping Ukraine on coming through to some kind of end to the war?
Yeah, so Zelensky, of course, lost the American support. I mean, it's still there, and there's the hope that the Democrats come back into power in 28. We just actually saw last week, off the top of my head, I can't remember how much the package was that the Congress pushed through, or the House of Representatives pushed through to provide support to Ukraine. Whether or not that will get through the Senate, we'll have to see, but the White House will likely veto it. So you're looking at just this drop in support over the last couple of years from the Americans to the Ukrainians. That is a hole the Europeans are really struggling to fill. I've been focusing so much on Iran. A lot of the numbers are kind of, I'm trying to recall, but essentially, you had this budget crisis in Ukraine that really blew out in the open back last fall. And I want to say that was about $165 billion shortfall for the Ukrainians for 2 years. And the EU was able to put together roughly $100 billion package that then faced all types of hurdles within the EU, including obstruction from Hungary and some other issues. But even with that package, $1 billion, it's still short $60 or whatever the numbers were, right? I mean, so you have this real issue, I think, for Zelensky on top of manpower issue in terms of making sure he's got enough troops to man the front line, but also to the corruption. We just saw his former chief of staff, Andrei J.MAH, arrested. He'd been chased from office several months ago, but now they finally, took him away. So there's those things that are sitting on top of him. But I think what's looming probably in keeping him up at night is this notion that we're going to run out of money, and the idea that this is how states, you call them proxy states, if you will, fall. Is you look at South Vietnam, you look at, say, Afghanistan, the money runs out. The money runs out, or not even in the case of Afghanistan, the money hadn't run out yet. The fear of the money running out created a panic. And then these systems that are incredibly corrupt, essentially patriots networks, and there's no difference between, say, South Vietnam and Afghanistan and Ukraine when it comes to how they're structured, how the corruption is everything. It's as I said, a patriot network. When those at the top of that patriot network start to fear that the money is no longer going to be coming in, they stop passing that money down.
Yes.
Right? And then when that money is not received below, then the system stops working. Things fall apart. People walk away, right? Food and ammunition aren't delivered. right? And that's how both Vietnam, I'm not taking anything away from the North Vietnamese, of course. Same with Afghanistan, not taking away anything from the Afghan Taliban. You look at the campaigns that both of those waged. Say 74, 75, and then as well too the Taliban in 2021. Brilliant campaigns, but the thing that really causes the downfall, the collapse, is that lack of external funding, the money getting shut off. And I think that's probably what's keeping Zelensky awake at night. I think the reality of modern warfare, the Ukrainians can hold their positions. They're going to lose several dozen square miles every month. But, in the last couple of months, we've not seen the Ukrainians lose any ground. I think one in the last couple of months, the Ukrainians gained ground against the Russians. There's a lot of speculation as to why that is. The Ukrainians have brought in not just newer drones, but a newer concept of how to utilize those drones. But certainly we could see this new generation of warfare having an impeding effect, causing issues for the Russians to advance. We've seen that really since 2024 or so, the way drones have stymied maneuver warfare, as we would call it, the ability to have troops out in the open in units trying to either break through or flank the enemy. With the drones now, you just can't do that. You can't be seen. If something is seen, it can be killed. The Israelis are learning this in South Lebanon right now. And so you have this, I don't want stalemate is, in the circles I'm in, Justin, stalemate is such a loaded term. It's such a people freak out when you use that term. It's incredible. But essentially, I think you have that. You have that here. And so for the Ukrainians, though, again, it's this issue of money. The manpower is an issue. The corruption's an issue. But certainly the money is the big thing. And so is Zelensky able to secure the funding to keep the war going? Can the Europeans provide that? Can they make it to, I guess a similarity you could make towards the British in 40, fighting the Germans, the Battle of Britain. They are essentially they're not blockaded, but they are going bankrupt. The Brits. Like the idea of being able to continue this fight against Germany alone. It's can they do that? Do they have the wherewithal to do it on their own? And most think they don't. And so the Brits throughout 1940 becomes this understanding of we just have to get through the American election, right? If we get through the American election, we get Franklin Roosevelt back in office, the Americans will come into the war. The Americans will backstop us. The Americans will support us. The Americans will reinforce us. Eventually, they will come into the war. I think maybe that's the Ukrainian thought here as well as the Europeans. We got to make it a 2028, and we get a Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or Wes Moore or AOC or whoever, and then the money will come back from the Americans for this war. Can they make it that long? We'll see. Because again, I think my thing for the Ukrainians has been for years now. Their biggest danger is economic collapse or government collapse, not military defeat. They've certainly been on their back foot their entire time. But I think with the way modern warfare is, as well as issues the Russians have as well, the Russians have not been able to win militarily. And I don't think they can win military. And so I'm still stuck on this belief that the Ukrainians can't win and the Russians can't lose. And when you have a situation like that, the thing can go on forever until there's some type of existential, there's something like the money runs out that causes one side to collapse.
Yeah, it's the money running out. But for the Ukrainians' hope on 2028 in the U.S., it's also time. Because this war has been going on for more than 4 years. And so at some point, the American public, the younger generation that's now voting, may just, tune out. And so that's their struggle. One last item on the geopolitical side of things. Cuba kind of flared up again. The head of the CIA was, I believe, cited in Cuba in the last few days, while everybody was
Right,
focusing on
right.
China. What do you make of this and the intentions of the U.S. towards the island?
It's not good for the Cubans. I mean, the idea that the Cubans have run out of fuel, that they are relying upon what little bit of gas they have, what limited solar they have to survive, to keep their hospitals open, to keep their fire trucks running. I mean, like things are incredibly dire there, and that is because of the American blockade. That is because of the American sanctions, the American siege, the American success with the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro turned off Venezuela's support to Cuba. The Americans have pressured the Mexicans to drop their support mostly. I mean, the Mexicans made a big show of sending a couple of support ships a couple months ago now, but you've not seen anything since, and especially you've not seen any fuel shipments. The Russians sent a tanker a few weeks ago now, and that was able to provide for 10 or 14 days worth of fuel, and now that's run out. And so you have this terrible situation, this dire situation. And then, Justin, like a scene out of a movie or a TV show, the director of CIA shows up there, right? I mean, this is right. I mean, like this is it's terrifying.
Yeah.
You have the Americans conducting reconnaissance flights, obviously preparing for battle or some type of campaign. You then have now we've seen stories in the press. Axios seems to be the White House's favorite news outlet. They seem to be very dependable for the White House, and of course, you had all the controversy in the last weeks over Barack Ravid, being the guy who is putting out the White House's, shorts, creating the conditions for the shorting of the oil markets and everything. But Axios putting out a story, and that not by Ravid, but by Mark Caputo, essentially saying the Cubans have all these drones. They've bought fleets of drones, 300 drones, and American intelligence has learned that they're going to use those to attack Guantanamo Bay, right? So essentially setting up the conditions, right? Essentially
Yeah.
setting up the narrative, right? To say they were about to attack Guantanamo Bay. Look, Guantanamo Bay is this little isolated, but they could have destroyed it. They could have overrun it. We had to go there to protect our Marines and sailors and soldiers and airmen who were at Guantanamo Bay, et cetera, et cetera. Better, which if you recall, of course, that was the story. Go back. Where are we now? 3 months almost. With regards to Iran, that the Iranians were going to attack us first, right? And certainly look at the legal brief filed to the United Nations by the United States. This is a war of self-defense. And of course, would be the storyline and narrative. It's already being into friendly newspapers. So certainly the idea too that is Cuba the way to pivot away from the Middle East? So we were talking before about what options Donald Trump has and trying to get inside his head and predict what's going to happen. I mean, this is why Vladimir Putin back in early 2024, when he was asked, who would you rather see, Joe Biden or Donald Trump win the election? And Putin said Joe Biden. And a lot of people were shocked because Joe Biden, obviously much more adversarial to Russia, right? Certainly, if Joe Biden was still president, the Ukrainians would be receiving tens of billions of dollars from the Americans, plus all types of other help from the Americans, intelligence and satellites and things, from satellite, things like that. And, Putin's explanation for that was, well, Joe Biden is predictable. Donald Trump is not. And so, we've seen the Americans go, Justin, from Ukraine to Gaza to Lebanon to Venezuela. Greenland was in there at some point, right? And then to Iran. The ability of the Americans to exert their will and do what they want has to be respected. Now, Whether or not they achieve what they're looking to do, whether or not they make things worse or whatever, that's another story. So but their will is certainly there. And so, does Cuba serve as a pivot? Does Cuba serve as a way to get away from the Middle East then, as well as also to achieve long stated goals of American administrations? I mean, this has been a bedrock of not just the Republican Party, but large parts of the Democratic Party as well. Donald Trump put heavy sanctions. Barack Obama, to his credit, took lessened sanctions on Cuba, allowed for travel, did a lot of good things. Not nearly enough, but better than any of his predecessors. And then Donald Trump got rid of all that, put in draconian sanctions, labeled Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the Biden administration come in and really didn't touch any of that. As Joe Biden was leaving the White House, he took Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism. But for the 4 years prior, the Biden administration had allowed them to be, had kept them on. I mean, so the political benefits of getting regime change in Cuba, of finally finishing this story, very similar to the story of Iran. 1979, the Iranians overthrow the American dictator. Same in Cuba. 1961, the Cubans overthrow the Cuban dictator. The blow to American interests, whether it's millionaires or or I don't know if they had billionaires back then in 1961 or not, but certainly the tangible impact to many Americans was real, as well as the overall insult to the American empire. And the same again in 1979. So, this desire to correct what was wronged so many decades ago, that has an inertia all of its own, the American foreign policy establishment. And then Donald Trump can say, just as he can say with Iran, hey, I stood up to the Iranians, no one else was willing to do it. Here, I'm the one who finally took care of Cuba. Since JFK, no American president was able to do what I was able to do with Cuba. Yeah, I mean, so I think you put all that together, and as well too. They say the American military is overextended when it comes to Iran. It's not so much the case with Cuba. Much smaller country, much less resources. Certainly not. Its military nowhere near the capabilities and capacity of Iran, and it's 90 miles from Florida. So right. Very easy for the United States. I mean, these American fighter pilots can go and drop bombs and be home for dinner, that night, that type of thing. So, all things point to this idea that, for the Cuban people, what's to come might be really horrific.
And it's been over 10 administrations. This issue has been always on the table. In fact, I thought for me, I would have put Cuba on the top of the list, with Marco Rubio and Donald Trump coming in as one of the main targets for their international efforts. Politically, there's a narrative there that could flip the midterms, especially with a big Cuban population in the States. We'll see what happens there. But the news that the CIA director was there and cited publicly was significant, and so we'll have to keep our eye on it. Now,
right.
Do you have a few
I'd say also too, John, remember that. Yeah, I do. I'm just going to say, with regards to the CIA director, remember he was the first. John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, was the first American to go to Venezuela after Maduro was deposed, after Maduro and his wife were kidnapped. Right. Ratcliffe was the first one there. So you see with Ratcliffe, who I think a lot of us, don't do ourselves a service by describing Ratcliffe as just essentially a shill for the Israeli lobby, which I think is how he got to prominence. But certainly his understanding of things, his ability to execute, and the trust that the White House has on him. I mean, he certainly has replaced Tulsi Gabbard in White House briefings, but also, too, we see him showing up and, leading these efforts It certainly says a lot about, again, the trust the White House has in him, but also his ability to carry out things and execute them.
That's right. Now, on a personal level, if you wish to discuss it, your personal story is something that's remarkable. But most personally, on the courage to take a decision that may run counter to what the most sensible thing might be. You took a decision to write a memo that was very important at the time. And my question to you is, what would you recommend to folks who have the courage to take those decisions? How do they face the backlash or the blowback they may face, and how to keep trudging along and recreate yourself long after that event has happened? Do you have a few minutes to share on the lessons and your advice for folks in military, but also in private sector, in businesses and banks that may be seeing issues and they need to
Right.
surface them up? What are your thoughts there, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, I think, Justin, I think the first thing to realize is that our adherence to groupthink, our susceptibility to peer pressure, right? The mob mentality is natural. It's part of how we evolved. If we didn't have this group loyalty, then our ancestors would have found if you disagree with the chief, you're going to end up in the woods with the wolves. And you're not going to be by the campfire, right? So there's an evolution that occurs, a societal evolution that adheres us that makes us want to be part of the group, wants to be part of the tribe, the clan, the unit, the village, what have you. And that there are psychological aspects of this, that when individuals leave the bubble, when someone leaves the group, the brain does what it can to force people back into the group. And so what you're up, and there's all types of incredible stuff out there. There's people who are not familiar with this. I'd say the first thing to look up is the Ash conformity experiments that were done in the 1950s, and showing just how people will conform, even when it makes no sense for them to do so, even when it's clear that the rest of the group is saying something is wrong. The pressure that people feel to fit in, to be a part, to not be exiled or excommunicated is such that, well, they will say the wrong answer, right? They will say, something that they know is wrong, because they have this existential like pressure to belong, right? To not be excluded. And so, I would say that to people who are in these positions where they are looking to speak out, where they are confronted by their own doubts, by their own hesitation, that is entirely natural. How it's supposed to work in these situations. Human beings are meant to conform. We're meant to adhere. We're meant to follow leaders. That's how our ancestors were. That's how our coding still is, right? You speak out. You go against something, even though you're right, even though you've got all the evidence and data behind you, but you feel that pressure. And that's the amygdala secreting chemicals into your brain, right, to try and get you to go back to the group.
Yes.
And that's why so many people who do speak out, who do, who are truth tellers or whistleblowers or dissenters or what have you, have secondary issues. They have depression. They have anxiety. Those, of course, then develop into substance abuse issues. I mean, there's other things too then that also are complicated. You step out, you leave group, you're probably leaving behind your income. You're leaving behind the safety net, right? You're right. You're cutting off, or maybe you're precluding future possibilities. And that those in themselves, of course, there's all types of understanding of how that would impact somebody. So I think that's that's just a long way of saying that it's not that hesitation, that fear. It's natural. I would say that the thing about how do you maintain yourself though, and how do you continue to have a career in what you do, even though you've spoken out against conventional wisdom, you've got your leadership, you've disagreed with the public narrative, is to keep at it, is to be persistent, is to maintain your edifice, right? Is to maintain your beliefs, is to maintain your convictions, and to continue to prove yourself right. And eventually, there will be a course correction. It may not be the way that you like it to be. It may look entirely different, but it will be validated. It will be vindicating. I mean, for me, it's certainly, my opposition to the Afghan escalation was vindicated over time. It didn't look the way I want it to look like. The vindication basically was with Afghanistan, the drawdown of American forces, the keeping of American forces on bases to keep casualties extremely low, the support, the continued upping of support for warlords and drug lords throughout Afghanistan to hold back the Taliban that way, and that was able to be maintained for years. Now, that's certainly what I wanted to see happen, but it does prove that what I was saying about the war, right, that came out the way I was saying it was going to come out, right? I mean, so you take that and you understand that you are up against a Leviathan. You are up against, a system. You are up against a corporation, whatever it is. It has its own inertia. It has its own purposes. It's a living organism.
Right.
And it's just, that's the nature of it, right? I mean, so I think it's that. If I would say to anybody who's spoken out, who has gone against things, who has be professional, but don't burn bridges, all those basic things. Be decent, but also too be persistent, and it may not. Certainly, I think the story of the guys from, say, like The Big Short, right? Who are now immortalized as having predicting the housing market bubble 22 years ago. I think that their vindication, maybe they're not as successful financially if they had just kept their mouths shut and gone along with everybody. But certainly they're immortalized as the guys who got it right. The same thing too. Look at the few journalists who were willing to go against the American government and the great, the great mass of American journalists in 2002 and 2003 to doubt what the American government was saying about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. So you have the guys from Knight Ridder, you got Jonathan Landy. I mean, very few in number who are willing to, who had the courage to say, no, this isn't correct. To go not just against the American government, but to go against the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, right? To go up against that, again, Leviathan, and certainly the idea, you're also too assuaging your conscience, and then maybe you'll get to sleep better. And it's certainly limiting. You're taking away your career prospects. You're hurting your income, right? You're making things, to put it politely, uncomfortable for yourself.
Yes.
But having been in both of those situations, where I was continuing to do the wrong thing, where I knew I was just lying about something and going along with it. And for me, the escalation of the Afghan war, knowing what that would mean in terms of lives ruined, right? That the understanding that more are going to die because of this, that was another factor as well. But the difference between knowing this is wrong and laying there being like, damn it, I've got $184 in my checking account. I mean, both those things are terrible. But the real horror is that existential horror. It's that moral horror of doing something that you don't believe in, doing something is wrong, right? The other things, you're going to be broke and it's going to suck and you're going to all those things. I don't want to be glib about that. It's very difficult. And most whistleblowers, most truth tellers, most dissenters have a very hard time. And that's the way it is for 5, 10 or so years afterwards, until either they find something else or they've reestablish themselves in the industry that they're in because they were proven right, by it. So it's difficult. It's hard. But certainly I would take the problems I have had. I mean, certainly I had a career trajectory. I was going to do I was going to extend for 6 months in Afghanistan. And then I was going to go to Harvard, right, and come at a 15 position, either at the State Department or a GS-15 or FS-1 position at the State Department or the CIA or the Pentagon or something like that. It was very clear where I was going with this. And then I would become an assistant. I'd go into the senior executive service and I'd become an assistant secretary of state or whatever, over at DOD or something. I could see that progression. So that went away. But looking back now, I'm grateful for not having to have put myself through all that, because I wouldn't have agreed with much of anything we were doing. I wouldn't have agreed with Libya. I wouldn't have agreed with Syria. I wouldn't agree with certainly anything we've seen in the Middle East. I wouldn't have agreed with supporting the Ukraine war in the way it was done. I would have, I believe shouldn't even gone to the war. It should have been negotiated beforehand. That this was a war that so many people wanted. And so I wouldn't have been able to stomach that, support that. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it with people. Yeah.
Are interested. No, I was just going to say, I from my high school, I graduated from school, Valley Forge Military Academy, which is actually the same school Governor Westmore attended a few years before me. I didn't go to serve in the armed forces. I actually had thought about going the foreign service route, but many of my classmates did. And basically, I saw what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so on behalf of those veterans who served our country, and some of them never came back, I just want to say thank you for taking that stand on the war in Afghanistan, because I think it kickstarted a process that resulted in the withdrawal. So on behalf of them, I just want to say thank you. It was gutsy what you did, and you were able to recreate yourself. So thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, Justin. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I thank you very much for reflecting on the power of being able to, recreate yourself and find something else. But Matthew, thank you so much today of providing us your time and your analysis. We went a little over, but I really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin.